Marvel characters have been around for quite some time. Well, some of them more so than others. And with the 52 or so characters that are portrayed and playable in Ultimate Alliance 3, I wanted to take a moment and look at who is the youngest character in Marvel's canon of playable characters and work our way back to the oldest in terms of their interpretation. And the orders surprised me a little bit, as I thought that some of these characters were not as young as they are, especially with how prevalent some of them have become in recent years thanks to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So let's backlog these characters and work our way back from the newest characters on the block all the way back to the oldest veterans in this game. And as we do that, make sure to check and see if you are subscribed to the channel. If you're not, make sure you fix that real quick as I bring daily variety content to you. And if you find today's video helpful and informative or enjoyable, make sure you hit that like button. So Spider-Gwen is the youngest character on the playable roster by a narrow margin, with her first appearance being in September of 2014. She is based off of a character that's been around a lot longer than that, that being Gwen Stacy, who first appeared in December of 1965. But as Gwen Stacy, or the Gwen Stacy that we were originally introduced to, never really took up the heroine mantle, well, there wasn't a method of backlogging this character any further than that. Miss Marvel, specifically Kamala Khan, who is the version that is portrayed here, has been around for just a little bit longer than that, first appearing in August of 2013. So she has certainly been around for a minute and is gaining some prevalence, or more prevalence now, so that she's had a portrayal with her own playable character in a video game, not just this one, but also with the Marvel Avengers that was produced by Square Enix last year. And in the near future, she will be receiving an exclusive Disney Plus series, which will be interesting to see as well as these characters continue to grow and progress. Miles Morales is the next character on our list, as he first debuted in August of 2011. And he has made waves similar to that which we've seen with Miss Marvel, but in a much more dramatic effect with his portrayal in a lot of popular media, including, but not limited to, the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse movie, which came out a few years back, as well as his titular video game, which released at the end of this past year on the PlayStation 4 and 5. Elsa Bloodstone rounds out the characters on the very, very bottom of this list, and the last of the playable characters that were introduced originally in the 21st century, with Elsa making her debut in December of 2001. The next couple of characters that we need to go over, I thought that a solid chunk of these were a lot older than they actually are, but that is not the case. Starting with Deadpool, he was originally introduced in February of 1991 and stormed onto the scene and has been making waves ever since, gaining a lot of traction in popular media, both in his movie portrayals, the vast array of characters and people who dress up as him for Comic-Con and other presentations, and he's a very quirky character, very lovable, so it's very easy to see why he has taken off as rampantly as he has. But before him, we had Gambit. Gambit was originally introduced in July of 1990. I thought that he was older than he was. This is one of the characters that was a little bit shocking to me, as I thought that he was easily from the 80s or even the 70s. But no, he was right at the midpoint of 1990, but is a really awesome character, and I wish that he was shown a little bit more love and portrayal in where he's been. Now, Venom is a very interesting character to talk about on this list in particular, mainly because the Eddie Brock version of Venom, which is the first version of Venom's character, was not groundly introduced until April of 1988. However, the symbiote has been around for a couple of years before that, first appearing as Peter Parker's titular costume in the 1984 line of comics. So the symbiote was introduced a while previous to Venom's overall inception, but I do have to base this off of the actual character, which is why he's a couple of rungs lower on this list. Cable is another one of those interesting characters in terms of why he's placed where he is, especially because as Nathan Summers, who is the core character, he was originally introduced in January of 1986, but he was not brought to be the character he's recognized as Cable until March of 1990. However, because the character itself was present and not just a component of him, I did want to bump him up in where he's placed in this listing. So that's why he wins out, whereas Venom or Venom's symbiote does not edge that out. Keeping up on our march backwards through time, we come to Elektra, who was first introduced in January of 1981. And she's had a couple of stints on and off as to how prevalent or how shown she has been, but she has been featured in a couple of feature films and TV series revolving around Daredevil, as that's mainly the central of comics that she pertains to, though she has had a couple of her own solo runs scattered in throughout there. Psylocke, though she was not always referred to as Psylocke, has been around for quite a bit longer. First appearing in December of 1976. So this character certainly receives a little bit more stripes as more of a veteran. Now, Rocket and Groot are listed here because I can't split the two up, and though they are currently known as being a dynamic duo and never seen apart from each other, they were both introduced independent of each other. And the reason that they're here at this point in time is because Rocket Raccoon's first iteration was in summer of 1976. I wasn't able to get a more specific date than that. However, he was vastly outclassed by how old Groot is, and so you will be seeing this character show up again later on down the road. And then we have Star-Lord, specifically Peter Quill, as there are a couple of other non-Marvel versions of Star-Lord that can be confusing if you try to look into this character's origin. But Peter Quill was originally introduced in January of 1976, and was mainly brought into the limelight thanks to the Guardians of the Galaxy film, which came out just a couple of years ago. And he is, of course, a beloved character for many different reasons, but most of all, his leadership over the Guardians of the Galaxy crew in their current iteration. Continuing on, we now come to Moon Knight, who was originally introduced in August of 1975. And get used to hearing that year for a little bit, because a lot of these characters have that in common. Though Moon Knight has not been highly featured in any popular media, per se, he does have an upcoming Disney Plus original series, which I personally am excited for, as I really fell in love with Moon Knight's character when I first started reading comics that he was introduced in. So I'm very eager to see more representation for this highly underestimated character. Gamora is next on the list, and she actually was introduced as Thanos' daughter quite a while after Thanos' introduction, and we will get to him in due time. But Gamora's first appearance was in June of 1975, and she, again, was mainly given her acclaim in recent years due to her participation in the Guardians of the Galaxy and that team ship. Now, the next three were actually all introduced around at the same time, if not concurrently with each other, so there's not really a good way to put these characters definitively in an order, but starting off, we do have Storm, where she was introduced in May of 1975, and I thought that she was a lot older, or had been introduced a lot further back than where she had been. However, that was not the case, and has been a relatively new addition to the X-Men lineup of comics. Colossus likewise was introduced around at the same time, and has gone through a couple of revisions since his original introduction, but he is certainly a beloved character for the different quirky items that he brings to the table. And personally, I like his portrayal from the recent Deadpool films, though he did appear in a couple of X-Men films prior to that. Rounding out the characters that were introduced around the same time, we do have Nightcrawler, who again was from that May 1975 run of the X-Men comics. But he certainly hasn't faded away, as there's a lot of things to love about this character. And Nightcrawler has had a couple of different iterations, portrayed by a few different actors. I personally like what we've seen from him from the more recent version of the X-Men films, and would love to see how he is integrated over into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as that will certainly be coming at some point in the near future. And who doesn't love Wolverine? Now, Wolverine does predate the previous couple of characters by a little bit, as he was originally introduced in October of 1974. Now, Wolverine mainly gained a lot of traction due to his very popular portrayal by Hugh Jackman in many an X-Men film, but he was still a very popular character even before Hugh Jackman took up the mantle of the character. Next on the list, we have Iron Fist, who came around in that same year of 1974, but a few months prior, in the month of May. And he ran around for a while in a duo series with Luke Cage, though Luke Cage was introduced a few years prior, which we'll get to him in just a few minutes. Now, one of my personal favorite characters is Punisher, and I love the representation that he's had from Jon Bernthal in the recent Punisher TV series. Very graphic series, but that is very true to the character that is Punisher. Now, there have been a couple of different Punisher-esque type characters, but the by far most recognizable is Frank Castle, and he was originally introduced in 1974 in the month of February. And I am eagerly hoping that Jon Bernthal will continue to portray this character in years to come, however they decide to continue the saga of Frank Castle within the cinematic productions. Blade is another one of those characters that is deeply beloved by his fan base, and I certainly fall into that category as well. Though he did have a series of movies where he was portrayed by Wesley Snipes that ran for a few years, he's receiving a revival to his cinematic representation in an exclusive Disney Plus series that will be coming sometime in the near future. However, Blade was originally introduced into the comic series in July. However, Blade was originally introduced into Marvel Comics in July of 1973. A few other characters that were introduced around the same time as each other, we of course have Thanos and Drax. They were both introduced into the comic series in February of 1973, though the notoriety that Thanos gained was primarily through the Infinity Gauntlet saga, which was in 1991. So that's where most people know Thanos from, though of course these characters do have a very intense history and have been around for about the same amount of time. Predating both of those by a couple of months, we have Ghost Rider. Now, there are several different versions of Ghost Rider with many different rider types, as well as a couple of cosmic iterations of the character. But the original introduction of the original Ghost Rider, Johnny Blaze, was in August of 1972. And he had a quite successful run of his own films starring Nicolas Cage several years back that are still quite enjoyable in my personal opinion. Now, we touched on him a few minutes ago, but as the first African-American superhero to ever have his own comic series, Luke Cage certainly deserves some extra attention here. Luke Cage was first introduced in said comic series in June of 1972, and has had a noteworthy amount of success, especially in recent years where he was given his own Netflix TV series, which I really enjoyed. Though he wasn't always known as Luke Cage, he was originally introduced with that name, briefly went by Power Man for a short period of time before being brought back and referred to again as Luke Cage more specifically. Now, another character that I absolutely love and am looking forward to seeing in a future adaptation of a film, Morbius is the next character on our list, originally being introduced in October of 1971. Now, he isn't as notable as some of the other characters that we've discussed, but I hope that he will receive a lot more noteworthy and admirable attention with his upcoming film in the next year or so, where he will be portrayed by Jared Leto. And if the trailers are anything to go by, this film is set to be quite a spectacle. Now, even though Luke Cage was the first African American superhero to have his own line of comics, Falcon was the first African American superhero. And he originally was introduced in September of 1969. Though when he was originally introduced, he had a pet falcon rather than a robotic drone counterpart, as that has been more of his recent iterations, particularly with his introduction into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Though I would love to see some sort of call out or reference to Sam Wilson's Falcon actually having a pet falcon, and maybe we'll see that in the Falcon and Winter Soldier series that's currently making its debut on Disney+. Now, there have been a couple of different iterations of Captain Marvel, but the Carol Danvers version, which is what's being portrayed with this version of the character, was originally introduced in January of 1967. And yes, she did have a brief stint as Miss Marvel. As a matter of fact, she has some alternate costumes that pay homage to that stint of her iteration in the comic, but she is currently more widely known as Captain Marvel and has since left the Miss Marvel moniker behind and passed that on to Kamala Khan. Next up on our list, we have Black Panther. And Black Panther has been around for quite some time and has received a lot of notable press, as he was excellently portrayed by the late Chadwick Boseman in many Avengers films, including his own solo title. Now, Black Panther's original introduction into the comics was in July of 1966, which, now come to think of it, makes me recant my previous statement about Falcon being the first black superhero. However, Black Panther does have a large amount of notoriety that follows him, and I am interested to see how Disney and Marvel will take the trajectory of the cinematic portrayal of this character going forward. Crystal is a character that actually surprised me a little bit with just how long ago she was originally introduced, as her debut was in December of 1965. And personally, I would have liked for her to have been a little bit more viable of a character in this game, but that is by no means a reason to rule her out or not pay any attention to her notoriety and what she's brought. Though she doesn't really have any representation in current media, we may perhaps see a version of the Inhumans be brought more to the forefront and further introduced with the Kamala Khan series that is being brought to Disney Plus in the future. So it is quite possible that Crystal and the other Inhumans that she abides with will quickly make their introduction into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Hawkeye was one character, however, that I knew has been around for quite some time, as he was originally introduced in September of 1964. And specifically talking about the Clint Barton version of Hawkeye, as there is a Kate Bishop version, but she came along much, much later and doesn't have a representation or even a nod in this video game. Though I do believe that both characters are being added as playable characters to the Avengers game by Square Enix at some point later this year. Daredevil predates Hawkeye by just a little bit, dating back to 1964 with his original introduction, and he actually was introduced around, if not at the same time as another character, which we'll transition and highlight right now. And that character is Black Widow. So Black Widow and Daredevil were introduced in the same month. I don't know specifically if they were introduced in the same comic specifically, but both of them were introduced in April of 1964. And Black Widow, of course, has received a lot of notoriety as of recent due to her portrayal by Scarlett Johansson in many an Avengers film. And with her upcoming solo venture, which will be in just a few short months, though it was intended to release last year before it was pushed back due to global health concerns. Scarlet Witch does predate Black Widow by a little bit and has become more and more prevalent, especially in recent years, thanks to her portrayal by Elizabeth Olsen in many an Avengers film and with the recent first season of WandaVision. Scarlet Witch's original introduction was in 1964, and though her powers and abilities have been worked around a lot as of recent, it does not write off when she was originally introduced, and she has certainly not fallen out of her representation by any means. The next couple of characters on our list were all introduced at the same time in the original Uncanny X-Men. Now, Jean Grey is the name of the character that Phoenix is most commonly associated with, though Phoenix is technically an entity of cosmic proportions. She has also come to know by that name as well. Jean Grey, along with her other counterparts that we will highlight here in just a moment, including Iceman here on the screen, were originally introduced in September of 1963. And again, alongside her, there was the introduction of Iceman, Cyclops, and Magneto, as these two characters were also introduced in that same original comic. And Magneto has played a little bit of jump rope with the line, though he does have heroic iterations in some of the recent versions of comics. He is mainly and mostly known as being a villain. And the previous characters have had at least one representation in some sort of recent film, though Magneto has had representation in a couple of those versions, both with Sir Ian McKellen and Michael Fassbender, which I both think did a wonderful job portraying the character that is Magneto. Doctor Strange does predate all of those characters by just a few short months, originally appearing in July of 1963. And as I've mentioned before, he is my favorite character within the realm of Marvel, but he has recently been gaining a lot more attention thanks to his portrayal by Benedict Cumberbatch in recent films in the MCU. And I absolutely love learning more and more things about this character. Now, Wasp has actually had a couple of iterations, and this was a little difficult for me to pin down exactly which version of the character it is, as technically the original introduction of Wasp was the Janet Van Dyne version, which was in June of 1963, just barely edging out Doctor Strange on this count. But she has been portrayed more recently as Hope Pym, which was a little difficult for me to decipher which version is portrayed here. Though due to the version of the costume that we're seeing, it does strike more of being Janet Van Dyne's version than anything that we've seen out of Hope Pym. So that's why she is up as high on this list as she is. Moving into some characters that are not nearly as convoluted with where their point of origin is, we have the very recognizable and beloved Iron Man, who of course has surged in popularity with his portrayal by Robert Downey Jr. in dozens of Marvel films up to this point in time. Now, Iron Man was originally introduced in March of 1963 and has had quite a run as a character and leading member of the Avengers. Thor and Loki are the next couple of characters on our list, and they have been around for the same amount of time, being introduced concurrently in August of 1962. And though their comics are a little bit odd, comparatively to the rest of them, they do have the benefit of being based, at least to some degree, in Norse mythology, as that's where both characters and inspiration for those characters was drawn from. Their portrayals by Tom Hiddleston and Chris Hemsworth, respectively, have certainly done these characters favors in terms of their current notoriety. And I am looking forward very much so to seeing what Loki, the Disney Plus series, will be like here in the next couple of months. However, Spider-Man does edge them out as by far one of the most recognizable characters from Marvel Comics as a whole. The Peter Parker version of Spider-Man, being the original and the version that we have portrayed here in this game, was originally introduced in 1962 as well. And though he's independent from the Thor and Loki line of comics, it is very important to note him on his own, as he's been very recognizable and had multiple different portrayals over the years. I remember growing up watching the Sam Raimi films where he was portrayed by Tobey Maguire, and the Andrew Garfield films, which took place a couple years thereafter, before the current iteration and portrayal by Tom Holland. And that's not even to mention the other many video games that he's been portrayed in, and most recently with his series on the PlayStation 4, which I highly enjoyed and would recommend if you haven't had a chance to play that as of yet. We are now nearing the top of the list of the oldest characters in the Marvel canon, and that of course brings us to Doctor Doom, who was introduced a couple of months after the introduction of the Fantastic Four as their main canonical villain and recurring villain. Doctor Doom was first introduced in July of 1962, and is a very powerful and potent character, though he has been portrayed in a couple of different versions of live-action films as well as TV shows. We will be certain to see more from this character due to his notoriety and longevity as a whole. Hulk, however, predates Doctor Doom by just a narrow margin, originally being introduced in May of 1962. And has had his fair share of theatrical representation as well. And the TV series is what we were originally introduced to him as. Most recently, he has been portrayed by Mark Ruffalo in many a Marvel Cinematic Universe film. And we will be sure to see more from this character due to just how notable he actually is and how long he has been around. Now, I know that I'd highlighted Thing and Human Torch on the previous screen, but I wanted to bring these four together, not only because they are a four-way tie for the third oldest character in the current playable game, but also because they are important as Marvel's first family. They were all originally introduced alongside each other in November of 1961 and have had a couple of different portrayals in a few different films, some more notable than others, as well as a standing TV series, as well as an animated TV series that ran for a while. Hopefully, we will be seeing these characters brought to the silver screen within the scope of Marvel Cinematic Universe sometime within the near future. Either way, I am eagerly looking forward to seeing more from these characters. Moving on from the Fantastic Four, I told you he'd be back, and that's Groot. Yes, we've already featured and highlighted Groot a little bit earlier with talking about Rocket and when Rocket was originally introduced, but Groot's first ever iteration was several years before Rocket ever showed up, and that was in November of 1960. Though Groot has gone through several different revisions, as well as including the revision where he now is no longer as talkative as he once was, or at least not with a standard vernacular. His original inception is a lot further back on this list than I think a lot of people actually recognize. And at our number one spot, constituting the oldest character in Marvel Comics, it's no surprise, it's Captain America, who was first introduced in March of 1941, and he's been making headlines in a lot of different media ever since, as well as being a rallying point during World War II, which is where this really kind of cemented this character into the current American representation. Of course, Captain America is most notably known by the Steve Rogers iteration, which was masterfully represented by Chris Evans, and I am very sad to see that that version of the character will no longer be present to the same degree in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but we have all been incredibly lucky to see the portrayal of this character, and he's not going anywhere anytime soon in terms of playable iterations and introductions. But let me know what you think. Were there any characters on this list that surprised you as to just how old they are? Did you think that some of them were older or younger than they actually were? Be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And once again, if you've made your way this far into the video and you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more daily variety content, and be sure to hit that like button. But until then, thanks again for watching, and I hope that you have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day.